Hello everybody, I am open to Module 2 for Week 2, and we will be covering Chapter 3, Social Perception, and Chapter 4, The Self, during this week's material. Here is the to-do list, which I've updated with due dates, and this shows the order of events in which you should be kind of working through this material. Again, you're listening to the podcast first, then you are checking the chapter objectives for this week, which I'll cover in just a moment. And before you get started on any work, I really want you to be looking for my feedback that I give you on your first discussion posts from last week. So sometime on Wednesday, the 27th in the afternoon, you can look for my feedback. I anticipate having it all graded by then. So you're going to want to go into your My Grades and see what you got. And there will be some comments there as well in the feedback of the grades. But then you also want to go back into the thread of the discussion where you've posted and see what comments I made on your posts as well. So make sure that you have some time to do that, and make sure you do it before you start working on your posts for this week. Because if you're doing something that could be improved, you want to know about that. If you're on the right track, you want to know about that. So all that feedback is necessary before you start to dive into that next discussion post, okay? So let's look at the chapter objectives, and then we're going to go back up to the to-do list. During this week, we're covering social perception and the self. So last week we talked about social cognition, how we think about the world around us. We also got into some of the basics of social psych and intro there, and some research methods into social psych. And here's where we start getting into how do we perceive our social world, what kinds of concepts come up there. So we're going to look at the major concepts of social perception, and a good deal of time is spent talking about nonverbal communication. Okay. In fact, I've posted a video for you that's all about nonverbal communication, and it's related to concepts and terms such as irrepressible, what happens when you have emotions that you can't suppress, deception, emotional contagion. These are terms we hear a lot about out in our culture, and they're all embedded in nonverbal communication. So you're going to be learning about like the universal emotions that we use to express what we're feeling, universal facial expressions, as well as unique facial expressions, and how we can be using these when we communicate with other people. So how does body language, including gestures, postures, movements, communicate emotion? What are other forms of nonverbal communication that communicate emotion or feelings? How do we use eye contact or touching? And then even drilling down deeper, we'll take a look at what's called micro expressions, and how these fleeting, momentary glimpses of facial expression can be very telling when we're trying to decipher a person's intentions or confidence or truth. So a lot of this is used in deception research. So that's another key area we're going to talk about in this chapter, is identifying and recognizing deception using some of those key nonverbal cues, and looking at different linguistic styles, looking at the nonverbal communication channel of content filtering, when you can't really hear what a person's saying, but you might know exactly what they're saying just by how it sounds, right? And then we're going to take a lot of that, and then we're going to turn our attention to a field in social psych called attribution theory. Attribution theory discusses how and why we make determinations as to other people's behaviors, right? So what do we attribute as causes to another person's behavior? So when someone acts a certain way and we think, wow, I wonder why they did that, that's attribution, right? So there's some different theories in there. Jones and Davis have a pretty big one, correspondent inference. And then Harold Kelly has causal attribution. So we're going to drill down on both of those and see how they relate to one another as well as their unique contributions. And then turn our attention to fundamental attribution error, which is an error in our cognition and an error in our thinking that leads to how we perceive others. So it's kind of building upon the last chapter in social cognition, because our thinking underlines the decisions and the judgments that we make about others. And that thinking is directly tied to then how we perceive other people. So we'll look at some major attributional errors like the actor-observer effect and self-serving bias, as well as consider some cultural differences with respect to those biases. We'll look at some internal and external causes of behavior and causal attribution, as well as that which we can control and that which we can't control when we're making those attributions. Discounting and augmenting principles are a part of that. When do we place a lot of emphasis on what people say and do? When do we not place a lot of emphasis on what people say and do? That's basically discounting and augmenting. Then we'll start looking a little bit more at traits. This is where social psych verges into a little bit of personality psych too. So you kind of get a mixture here. In fact, the field of social psych isn't usually by itself. It's usually connected to personality psychology. So like myself, for example, my doctorate is in social and personality psychology. Those are two fields of psych that are very intricately related. In fact, one of the major journals in the field is the Journal of Personality and Social Psych, JPSP. It's a huge journal, peer-reviewed journal that looks at all kinds of studies in those two subfields of psychology. So when we talk about traits, we're getting into specifics about the person, but the person is always embedded within the greater society that they live. So social psych plays a huge role on what makes a person and what kinds of things support a person's maybe natural or innate traits that they have from birth. So we will look at some personality theories, specifically implicit personality theories, and how do they relate to the judgments we make about others. And how do we go about doing that? What kinds of information do we use when we're making judgments about others? We'll take a look at some tactics that we tend to use in a field called impression management when we want to give off a certain impression to others, or we want others to think something in particular about us. We may make more of an effort at managing the impression we're having on other people. So that's pretty much that chapter. And then chapter 4 dives a lot into the self-concept, self-attributions, self-esteem, social comparisons, and how they relate to the self. So we're going to be taking a look at social identity theory. It's the huge component here, and taking a look at how the social context around us helps us to form our social identity and dictates how we socially present ourselves. And this has a lot to do with the comparisons that we make with others in perceiving ourselves and knowing our own self-worth, and we base a lot of it on those social comparisons. So self-esteem is probably the term you're all more familiar with, which is basically just, how we feel about ourselves. But how we feel about ourselves is affected by the people around us and what we're exposed to. So we'll take a look at some of the biases that we've already learned about in social cognition and how those can relate to our thinking when it comes to ourselves. And we'll take a look at some interesting research on gender differences in the self, cultural differences, and how we use social comparison theory to make those comparisons with others, and what can be self-protective, protect our self-esteem, and what can be damaging, and then how we might monitor who we are when we are around other people. Sometimes we care more about what others think of us. Sometimes we don't. It might depend on where we are or who we're around. But we'll talk about some of that and how some people are more targets of different threats to the self. And if you're a person in a group who is more at risk for prejudice or discrimination, you may be more aware of some of the biases that exist against your ethnicity, your gender, and so these things can affect then how you view yourself. So those are the 2 chapters in overview. Please take a look at your lecture slides for chapters 3 and 4 and compare those with what you're going to read in the book. Again, you should be having those maybe open or printing them out as you're reading in the book. That would be super helpful. If you print them out, you can write in the notes margin information that you find in the book that's related. Again, I encourage you to use the audio option of the textbook. By now, you all should have your textbooks. I will not be posting any more PDFs of the chapters, mainly because that's a copyright issue and I can't. So make sure that you have those textbooks in. And again, it's an e-text. So the minute you buy it, you have access via an access code. And so you just want to make sure that you have that. Then you want to watch all the video links I've posted below, before you go ahead and read the supplementary articles. I think this is going to be a better way because the video links that I've posted map directly onto chapter 3 and chapter 4. So it's good to kind of read those chapters in tandem with watching the video links. And again, in Revel, as you're reading the text, they also have videos in there that you should be watching. All the videos are posted below: fundamental attribution error, impression management, some stuff on social concept and self-identity, social identity theory, and then how we look at ourselves in the digital world that we're embedded in. A couple interesting short little video clips, and all these are very short. The Dove Real Beauty sketch talks about the self-comparison, and all of that. Okay, so I think the longest video that I have on here for you to watch this week is the Secrets of Body Language, and you're going to actually access it through the Ely Library database called Films on Demand. Okay, so you have to log in to the Ely Library. Once you're in there, you're going to go to Databases, A through Z, and you're going to select F for Films on Demand, and then you're going to type in Secrets of Body Language, and then it gives you access to this whole video, which you cannot find the entirety on YouTube. But you have to make sure that you're using Firefox or Chrome, again, to access anything here in Plato. Edge is also another one you can use, but Safari and Internet Explorer are not browsers that are going to support the downloading of these videos or PDFs or any material in the class, and they can actually slow you down. So make sure that you're doing that. I posted an announcement about that. And then once you've watched all the videos and you're ready to go, you can go ahead and contribute to the discussion this week. You're going to click in here. You're going to be answering these 2 questions about first impressions and high versus low self-monitoring. You're going to post those by Friday, right? And then by Sunday, you're going to pick 3 people that you're going to respond to. All right. So once again, just make sure you read my discussion feedback to you from last week so that you can get that before you do these. And then you'll be ready to take your exam, which is on chapters 3 and 4. Okay. That wraps up the week. I just want to go back up here to our to-do list, make sure we didn't miss anything. Everything's up there. Again, as you're working through this material, if you have any questions about the material, concepts, anything like that, please feel free to email me and I'd be glad to point you in the right direction or give you some more information that you might need. All right, thanks everyone.